Hey, I'm back from Washington to tell you that the United States is backing Hamas against Israel in this war. I'll have all the details coming up on In Focus. Over the past, 3 months or so, but really over the past 2 weeks, U.S. President Joe Biden has made it all but official that what the United States wants, what the United States seeks, what his administration seeks is for Hamas not to lose this war, which means, of course, that Israel loses this war. And he's gone out of his way in every area of U.S. policy regarding Israel, the Middle East, Hamas specifically, and Iran and its proxies more generally, to side with Israel's enemies against Israel everywhere he can. I actually wrote an article setting out everything that he was doing until last week in JNS that came out last week, and you should take a look at it. I think it's called 360 Degrees of Hostility. And you should look at that one, which gives all of the gory details. But President Biden basically he and Blinken and their underlings to defend a policy that essentially supports Hamas against Israel. They insist that the Palestinians are just like Americans and that if you support America, you have to support the Palestinians. Secretary of State Tony Blinken was here last week visiting, and he made this pretty explicit in a statement that he made to the media after his meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Here, let's just go to the clip for a second.
Israelis were dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th. The hostages have been dehumanized every day since. But that cannot be a license to dehumanize others. The overwhelming majority of people in Gaza had nothing to do with the attacks of October 7th. And the families in Gaza whose survival depends on deliveries of aid from Israel are just like our families. Their mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, want to earn a decent living, send their kids to school, have a normal life. That's who they are. That's what they want. And we must not lose sight of that. We must not lose sight of our common humanity.
So here what you see is Blinken saying, there are moms and dads and kids just like us, and we want to help them because they're just like us. And so the real question is, are Palestinians just like us? Are they just like Americans? So first of all, I think more than 1% of Americans like Americans. But in a Palestinian opinion poll that was taken by the premier Palestinian survey organization in December, it works out that only 1% of Palestinians support the United States. 99% of Palestinians oppose U.S., and by the way, they oppose Biden, who's their best friend ever, and only 1% support him. So that means that probably in the sense of how they feel about the United States, Palestinians are not like Americans. And what about their support for, genocide? So it works out that 81% of Palestinians support Hamas, including 89% of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. So this is a society that supports a genocidal terrorist organization. Also, over 80% of Palestinians support Hamas's invasions and the slaughter that it carried out on October 7th and think that it was totally justified. So you're talking about a society that overwhelmingly supports the day of genocide on October 7th and supports its primary perpetrators, a Hamas terrorist organization that initiated it. And when we're on that, it was a Hamas-led invasion. It wasn't only carried out by Hamas, it was carried out as well by thousands of Palestinians from Gaza who entered into Israel, into the communities of the Western Negev after the Hamas first invaded. Thousands of them participated. They burned Israelis alive in their homes. They took them hostages back to Gaza. They looted their homes. They killed them. They mutilated the corpses. They raped Israeli women. So this is what the Palestinian civilians in Gaza did. It was a Hamas-led invasion. It wasn't Hamas only involved. It was Hamas, Islamic Jihad. It was Fatah. We've talked about this. Fatah, which is the core organization of the Palestinian Authority. They also participated in the day of genocide on October 7th and filmed themselves, as did their Hamas counterparts, carrying out their crimes against humanity on the residents of the Western Negev and the IDF soldiers that they slaughtered that day as well. So we're talking about Palestinians that the U.S. Secretary of State and the U.S. President insists are just like Americans, right? Just like Americans, and they have to be worried about just like Americans. And overwhelmingly, they support the acts of genocide and the organization that is organized around the goal of annihilating the Jews worldwide and annihilating the state of Israel and the Jews within it. It's in their charter. It's what they do. It's what they did on October 7th when they had a clear shot. It's what they've done since their inception through terrorist attacks against Israelis every day. So that's who they are. And if that wasn't clear enough, we should talk a little bit about the hostages that they're holding. So I came home yesterday, Monday. I flew out of Washington on Sunday, and I arrived Monday afternoon back in Israel. And when I turned on my cell phone after the plane had landed, I got the incredible news that IDF and Israel Counterterror Police Force unit had rescued 2 of the 136 hostages that are being held by Hamas in Gaza, Fernando Marman and Louis Har. One in his 60s, one in his 70s, were being held in the home of Gazan civilians in Rafah, in the border town of Rafah that goes across to the Egyptian border. So they were being held in an apartment by a family in Rafah, and they're not the only ones. Amongst the 110 hostages that Israel got released in the hostages for a terrorist deal and the ceasefire in November, many of the hostages relayed that they were being held hostage by families of civilians in Gaza. And so these 2 men, they've attested to the fact that they were rescued in the home of a family, supposedly civilians, just like Americans, in Gaza, and they were starved there. They were treated as servants or slaves by their captors. They cooked for them, but while they were cooking for their captors, they themselves were starved. Doctors who treated them at Sheba Hospital upon their arrival in Israel in the wee hours of early Monday morning, said that they had lost half of their body weight during their captivity in Gaza and that they were eating half a pita a day with white cheese. It was like cream cheese, which is generally low fat. So they were eating half a pita a day, 2 grown men, elderly men, throughout their captivity in Gaza until they were rescued by Israeli commandos on Sunday night, Monday morning. And they were feeding the Gazans that were holding them captive. So they were preparing meals for them, not allowed to eat them. And this jives with what Mia Shem, another released hostage, said after she was released in the hostages for terrorists deal back in November. She said that she was held by a group of Hamas terrorists at one point in her captivity and that she cooked for them to avoid being raped. And she was also being starved. She said that before she moved into the apartment with a terrorist, she was being held by a Hamas terrorist and his family in a room in his apartment, and that his wife would bring him food, and she didn't get any. His children would come in with bags of sweets and offer them to their father and eat them in front of her and go, and she was starving. So that they were starving her. They were actively starving her and then sadistically eating in front of her. And in the case of Fernando Marman and Louis Har, they were being forced to cook for their captors who were civilians, and they were being starved. So that's the Palestinians who are just like Americans. Americans don't do that. So when Blinken and Biden insist that the Gazans are just like Americans, they're actually slandering the American people by comparing them to a genocidal society that takes joy in starving Jews and raping Jews. And that brings me to Sheryl Sandberg, the former CEO of Meta, the Facebook parent company. She's been going around Israel documenting the sex crimes that Hamas carried out, continues to carry out against the hostages in Gaza and carried out on October 7th. So she interviewed Agam Goldstein Al-Moog, and at least part of Agam's testimony was posted online today. And Agam is 18. I think she just turned 18. She was taken captive by Hamas on October 7th, along with her mother and her two younger brothers. Her older sister and her father were killed on October 7th by the same terrorists who then took them captive. So they were being held hostage. And she had an earlier testimony said that she and her mother were brought to an UNRWA school where they seemed really nice and congenial to them. They gave them mattresses to sit on. And Agam and her mom thought, gee, not all of these Palestinians are terrible. But then they realized that they were being used as human shields, because shortly after they arrived at the school and got mattresses to sit on and everything like that, the Hamas began shooting missiles at Israel from within the schools. And everybody clapped and said, Allah Akbar, every time they shot off a missile. So in her testimony to Sheryl Sandberg that was posted online today, Gam said that, and this was like I think the last couple of weeks she and her family were being held hostage in Gaza. They were sent into the tunnels and held in cages along with other hostages, including women who were not released in the last hostages for terrorist swap in November, who are still being held in Gaza, and also young men. So these are, I would assume, they're the soldiers. And half of the hostages that she spoke to, that she met with during her captivity, relayed that they had been raped, that they had been sexually tortured and physically tortured. So they were subjected to physical and sexual torture and abuse, including rape. And then she went on to describe how one of the female hostages described to her a rape that she had suffered at the hands of her captor in Gaza. And I don't feel like showing it to you on this show, because probably there are some amongst you who don't want to watch it, but you can go to my Twitter feed and see it there. So these are the regular Gazans. This is how they treat Israel. This is what they think of Israel. This is how they treat our hostages. And if we're already on the subject of UNRWA, in his conference, so the United States found out, Israel released evidence a couple of weeks ago. I think I talked about this before I went to Washington, that showed that 12 UNRWA supposedly relief workers, some of them are teachers in UNRWA schools, actually are murderers. They actively participated in the invasion of Israel and the murder of Israelis on October 7th. And so Israel provided proof to the Americans and to the UN, attesting to their participation of these 12 UNRWA employees in the invasion and the slaughter of Israelis on October 7th and the capture of Israeli hostages that day. And the United States announced, the Biden administration, that it was freezing its funding. But what is not really reported is that I think the U.S. had pledged over $1 billion to UNRWA. And what they did just hours before they froze U.S. funding to UNRWA is they transferred all of the funding except for $300,000. So the amount of money that the U.S. has actually not transferred to UNRWA that was allotted for the UN organization is just $300,000. That's all they're not getting. They got the overwhelming majority of the over $1 billion that the United States had pledged to them. So it was sort of a lie. And then on Monday, President Biden met with King Abdullah of Jordan, and there he said that he doesn't support closing down UNRWA because they're really an important organization, support for genocide involvement with genocide aside. But aside from the 12 that were proven to have taken active part in the invasion of October 7th, Israel has already also shown that 10% of UNRWA employees in Gaza are active members of Hamas. And I think that number is grossly underestimated or understated. In 2014, Israel had proof that 90% of UNRWA employees in Gaza were members of Hamas. But they said 10% of UNRWA employees in Gaza are active members of Hamas today. So let's just go with that. Aside from that, last week, I mean, you guys saw the footage. We can show you a little here. The IDF discovered a tunnel under UNRWA's headquarters. Its central headquarters. It's like their headquarters, right? It's like their headquarters in Gaza City. And they found in this tunnel was the hub. It was Hamas's intelligence center and its IT hub. It had a server farm in it. And where was it getting the electricity for its server farm and for its intelligence center? From UNRWA, right? UNRWA knew that Hamas had its intelligence hub and its IT hub underneath their headquarters in Gaza. How do we know that UNRWA knew? Because in 2014, while Hamas was digging the tunnel that served as its intelligence center and its IT hub, the asphalt on the street next to UNRWA's headquarters collapsed because it was being tunneled out. It was being hollowed out, right? And so they absolutely knew. Aside from that, they knew because they pay the light bill. They pay the electricity bill. And it works out that UNRWA was paying Hamas's electricity bill for its intelligence center and its IT hub. And, imagine you get an electricity bill one day. I get them where you have spikes in your electricity bills because it's winter and you're using your heat, or it's summer and you're using your air conditioning, and you think about this, is this ridiculous? Is this right? So imagine getting, an extra $1 million that you have to pay in electricity every month. And you never notice it because UNRWA said it never noticed that they had no idea that Hamas was operating its intelligence center and its IT hub underneath its central headquarters in Gaza City. No idea whatsoever. And not only that, the tunnel itself was fueled by gas, right? By a generator. And where was it getting the fuel for its generator from? That's right, UNRWA. It's all siphoned off fuel. We talked about it in the past, that 60 to 70% according of the humanitarian aid, including the fuel that goes into Gaza, goes directly to Hamas. Well, now we know why. It's distributed by UNRWA, and UNRWA is Hamas. And by the way, those teachers in UNRWA schools that are holding hostages, well, not surprising, because they practice what they preach. What they teach to the students in their schools in Gaza is genocide. It's annihilation of the Jews, which is why you get the results you get in Palestinian surveys of opinion, that they overwhelmingly support the annihilation of the Jews. One of the most outstanding, points that I raised in a lot of the briefings that I gave in Washington last week that came out of the opinion surveys of the Palestinians that I just find sort of serve as a testament to really the nature of the society that Tony Blinken says is just like the Americans, is that 94% of the Palestinians said that October 7th made them more proud than they had ever felt before about their identity as Palestinians. So that the one-day genocide, the one-day Holocaust that the Palestinians enacted against the Jews of Israel on October 7th, and non-Jews, by the way, who fell by the wayside, they said that made them prouder than any other day in their history. They were never so proud to be Palestinians as they were after October 7th, as they have been after October 7th. So this gives you a sense. Well, again, you get out what you put in. You teach children that they have to aspire to genocide, and look at that. They do. And when you carry it out, they're happy and proud because you taught them, you indoctrinated them from the day they were born, that that's what they're supposed to aspire to. That's what they're supposed to seek, the annihilation of the Jews. And so that's what you get. And, Shurat Adin, this Israeli international law center that sues, banks that have accounts from Hamas and other things like the Arab Bank, and they try to get restitution for the families of Israeli terror victims. So Shurat Adin, which basically means the letter of the law, they submitted a petition to Defense Minister Yoav Gallant asking him, in the name of the families of the victims of October 7th, to designate UNRWA a terrorist organization. And I think that they should. And Senator Cruz, who I was delighted to meet with last week, Senator Ted Cruz, he is looking into the fact that UNRWA in the United States has a 501c3 organization that's a nonprofit organization for contributing to UNRWA. So essentially, you're contributing to a terrorist organization, as Israel is now exposed. UNRWA is Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization. UNRWA is a terrorist organization. Its members aid and abet and participate in terrorist acts against Israel. It's a terrorist organization. It trains people to be terrorists in its institutions, which are used as missile launching sites and weapons depots and underground tunnels for Hamas intelligence centers and IT hubs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Cruz says he wants to go after the donors. He had this important tweet that came out the other day. It says the United Nations Relief and Works Agency has been knowingly providing material support for Hamas terrorists who committed unspeakable atrocities against over 1,000 Israelis and dozens of Americans. That support included salaries and facilities. Foreigners who knowingly funded UNRWA should be subject to sanctions, and Americans who knowingly fundraised for them should be investigated for criminal material support. I'm currently circulating language on these issues and will continue to advance these measures until the people who enabled this terrorism are held accountable. So that's UNRWA. Then we go to the journalists. Remember last year, I think it was, or 2022, IDF forces operating in the terror hub in Samaria of Jenin were in a firefight with Islamic Jihad terrorists. Islamic Jihad, like Hamas, but even more than Hamas, it's an Iranian-created organization. It was founded by Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps in 1988. So it is literally just Iranian. Hamas has some stuff that's organic to Gaza. It was founded by Gazans, and then it became part of Iran's terror nexus after it was founded. But Islamic Jihad from the get-go, just an Iranian terrorist organization. Anyway, in this firefight, Shireen Abu Akleh, it was in December, I think, of 2022, was an Al Jazeera journalist, and she was embedded with Islamic Jihad terrorists in this firefight, okay? She was with them. She was covering it for them. She was giving their side of the story because she's an embedded reporter with Islamic Jihad terrorists. And this was sort of her mode of operation as an Al Jazeera reporter. So Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in the crossfire in this gun battle between IDF forces and Islamic Jihad terrorists. And after this happened, Tony Blinken announced that this woman who had no known ties to the United States, she was born in Israel and she had never lived in America, but he immediately discovered that she's an American citizen. So this American citizen, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is a Palestinian who was embedded with an illegal terrorist organization, so designated by the U.S. State Department. She's killed in the crossfire, and the U.S. demands an Israeli investigation of her death, accused Israel essentially of deliberately killing Shireen Abu Akleh. And then later on, the FBI announced that it was carrying out an independent investigation of Shireen Abu Akleh and wanted to investigate individual IDF soldiers who it claims were incriminated in her killing so that they could be brought to justice. So this is IDF forces engaged in counterterrorism operation in the terror hub of Jenin, and the United States is accusing them of carrying out a war crime for killing an embedded reporter with Islamic Jihad terrorists. So that is the nature of Palestinian journalism, and also the nature of the U.S., the Biden administration's behavior towards these terror-supporting or terrorists wearing press badges. So this brings us to a new revelation that we discovered this week, which is that during operations in the northern part of Gaza, IDF forces recovered the laptop that belongs to another Al Jazeera reporter by the name of Mohammed Washba. So Mohammed Washba, Al Jazeera reporter, he appears on Al Jazeera TV. Al Jazeera, of course, is the terror TV that operates out of Qatar's capital, Doha. It's a Qatari television network, terrorist network. It was the home station of Al Qaeda, of Osama bin Laden, and it is the home network of ISIS, and it's of Hamas and every other jihadist terror organization that's aligned with Iran. So that's Al Jazeera. So this fellow, Mohammed Washba's laptop is recovered by IDF forces in a battle in northern Gaza, and his pictures on his personal laptop proved that he's a senior Hamas terror commander who works in Hamas's anti-tank missile unit, and he also develops drones for Hamas. So this guy who is a reporter is actually a terrorist commander who is responsible, who works for, who leads forces in Hamas's anti-tank missile unit and its drone development unit. So that's who he is, or like a Hamas engineer or whatever. That's what this guy does. And then he wears a press badge, and with a press Kevlar vest, and he has a microphone, and he pretends that he's a member of the press. And that's who the Palestinians are. So their journalists are terrorists. Their relief organizations, the UN Relief Works Authority, that's supposedly responsible for taking care of Palestinian refugees, which are just people who are descendants of people who left Israel 5 generations ago, and they're not allowed to ever stop being refugees. So that's 80% of the people of Gaza fall into that category. And so the UN, which is supposed to serve them and be a neutral organization, is a terrorist organization. The people of Gaza are terrorists. They hold hostages. They support Hamas overwhelmingly. Thousands of them were directly participated in the slaughter of October 7th. And yet here is Tony Blinken saying that they're just like Americans, and only 1% of Palestinians support what the United States is doing in this war, and over 90% of them hate the United States. So these are the people that the United States wants to give a state to. And by the way, what would that state look like? So the United States says that the Palestinian Authority, which is run by Fatah, whose members participated in October 7th, that ostensibly controls the Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank, 89% of whom support Hamas and the slaughter of October 7th, that Fatah is a credible moderate organization. The Palestinian Authority, which it controls through its president, through PLO chief Mahmoud Abbas, is moderate. And what has to happen now is to revitalize the Palestinian Authority and let them take over Gaza after the war is over as a gateway for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, went to Hamas's capital, to Qatar, to Doha this week, and met with Hamas leaders there under Qatari auspices, because Qatar is Hamas, just like Gaza is Hamas, just like the Palestinians are Hamas. They're all one big Hamas family. So Mahmoud Abbas goes to Qatar, and he meets with all of these other terrorists, and they sit down and they come up with a plan for a revitalized Palestinian Authority. Now remember, Hamas is supposed to be annihilated in this war, and President Biden ostensibly supports Israel's goal of eradicating Hamas. But here it is in Doha, Qatar, which Biden designated a major non-NATO ally at the beginning of this term. So they're all together, Hamas leaders, Qatari leaders, and supposedly moderate PA leaders, and they're talking about how to revitalize the Palestinian Authority, as Biden says they must. And what do they come up with? They came up with this plan that they announced, that the PA announced. The announcement said that they're going to put together a unity government of Hamas and Fatah that's going to be led by technocrats, by professionals, because that sounds good to the Europeans, right? Technocrats, professionals. So these terrorists in suits are going to come from Hamas and the PA, Fatah, so the organization that 90% of the Palestinians support Hamas, and another 5 or 10% of the Palestinians support Fatah. They're going to join a unity government. Not that it matters, but obviously this is going to be controlled by Hamas. And the icing on the cake, not at all a surprise, is that Salam Fayyad, the former PA technocratic professional prime minister who was installed by the Bush administration back in 2004, I think, or 2006, he is going to come back to power to lead this new revitalized Palestinian Authority, and that's going to be moderate, and it's going to be reformed, and it's going to be technocratic, and it's all going to be great. And this is all why? Because the United States wants a fig leaf. They don't care. They know. They like to pretend that the people of Gaza, the people of Judea and Samaria, the Palestinians are just like Americans, but they know full well who they are. They know. They're just lying. They're lying to themselves. Maybe they're certainly lying to the American people. And their policy is based on this lie. That, all these facts that I read out now show and they've all been known forever by anybody willing to look, bear out that the Palestinians are not like the Americans. The Palestinians are like the Nazis. They're a genocidal society. They're a Nazi society that, like the Nazi German society, are dedicated to the proposition that genocide of the Jews is the highest ideal. And at least the Germans, to their credit, had a national identity that was separate from killing Jews. The Palestinians don't even have that. Their entire national identity, thanks to organizations like UNRWA that funded by Western governments, they don't have any independent identity or identity independent of the cause of annihilating the Jews. That's all they're about. They're strictly Holocaust. That's it. They want Auschwitz. That's it. And we got it on October 7th. And now the United States thinks the best idea would be to give them Judea and Samaria, Israel's heartland and strategic backbone. Give them that, and give them Gaza, Jerusalem, and they'll have this reformed Palestinian Authority controlled by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists who hate Israel and want to annihilate the Jews, and that'll bring peace. That's the American policy. And that brings us to the second half, really the first sentence that Blinken said in that clip. I'm not going to replay it because yuck, but this is how he began his statement, talking about how, the Palestinians are just like Americans. He said, Israelis were dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th. The hostages have been dehumanized every day since. But that cannot license the dehumanization of others. Says that brings us to the second half of Blinken's statement. He says, Israelis were dehumanized in the most horrific way on October 7th. The hostages have been dehumanized every day since, but that cannot be a license to dehumanize others. That cannot be a license to who? Well, obviously to the Israelis, right? Because if the Palestinians are like the Americans, then the Israelis must be like Hamas, right? Because the Hamas is really Americans, and that means that the other side, the side that's trying to defeat Hamas, to eradicate Hamas, has to be the bad guys. So here, yeah, it's true. Hamas, they dehumanize Israelis, they dehumanize the hostages still. But, Israelis, they're really Hamas. So that was what his statement was. And how are they trying to bear this out? So they have all these false claims about the Palestinians. They have to match their fantasy Palestinian moderates, Democrats, people you want to give a state to, with Israelis who you want to take a state away from because they're terrorists and they're evil. And so what they came up with, of course, was the settler violence blood libel. And I think 3 months ago, actually, I'm sure 3 months ago, it was like on December, or 2 months ago, I think it was on December 13th. Anyway, we're going to post the link to my podcast that came out 2 or 3 months ago about the whole libel of settler violence that I did shortly after this all started, that shows what it's all about. You'll see it in the description of this broadcast, and you can link to it. But basically, they started this whole blood libel about the settlers. And what did they say? They said that there's a huge increase in settler violence by Israeli settlers in Judea and Samaria against innocent, guileless Palestinians that do nothing wrong, and they're just out in the fields or whatever, and planting their olive trees and minding their own business. And then these mean settlers come up with guns and Uzis, and they shoot them or whatever, and they die, and it's terrible, and Israelis are evil. So that's the libel that came out. And I showed 3 months ago or 2 months ago, whenever it was, that how it works. So what happens is that you have anarchists who work for these European or American leftist-funded NGOs in Judea and Samaria. Some of them are actually even Israeli anti-Semites. And a lot of them are people who are imported from abroad. And they work with the Palestinian Authority and with other Palestinian terrorist organizations. And what they do is they start riots and they start provocations, most importantly, in Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria or at the gates of Israeli communities in order to provoke a response from Israeli residents of those communities or the security guards, the first responders in those communities, and then they videotape it all, and they claim that they're being attacked by the people who they just provoked. And so, and then they send these videos, which they post on Facebook usually, to their friends who work in Biden-aligned NGOs in the United States. And so those NGOs then send the allegations against the Israelis to their friends in the State Department, first and foremost, Hadi Amar, who's in charge of U.S. policy towards the Palestinians and has a record of supporting Hamas and suicide bombings. So he's in charge of Biden administrations of Blinken's Palestinian dossier. And then he gets the information, sends it to his friend Maher Bitar, who was also an anti-Semite and anti-Israel activist from Georgetown University. He led BDS campaigns there, etc. He supports Palestinian terrorism, and he's the director for intelligence in the National Security Council. He prepares the president's daily intelligence briefing, so then you can go to him, and then it goes directly to Biden's bloodstream through the daily intelligence briefing that is presented to him by or prepared by Maher Bitar, and then presented by Jake Sullivan. So that's how it works. So you have these anarchists on the ground that work with the Palestinian Authority and other Palestinian terrorist organizations. They stage provocations against Israelis. When Israelis respond, they tape it, they post it on Facebook, they send it to their friends in America in these NGOs that are aligned with, like Code Pink, Palestinian, what is it called? Palestinian Solidarity Committee, and others that are aligned then and working with the State Department. They send it to the State Department. The State Department sends it to the National Security Council. The National Security Council briefs the president. The president comes out and says, Israeli settler violence. So in December, the administration used these claims to issue a travel ban on settlers involved with settler violence. And there's no description of that, except that they're also against this two-state solution. So that language, demonizing settlers for settler violence and their supporters, ended up being used in this executive order that Biden issued on February 1st, where he designated four Israelis as subjected to U.S. sanctions because of their engagement in settler violence. And none of them are criminals. None of them have been indicted or charged or convicted of any crime, violent or otherwise, by the Israeli police. So they're not. So what are they? They're ranchers. They own ranches in Judea and Samaria, and they herd goats and sheep, and they're subjected to constant theft, pillaging of their livestock, and attacks and assaults by Palestinian mobs who come out, and then working with these NGOs, they allege that these shepherds, these ranchers who are defending themselves, are actually attacking them. So these people just had all of their bank accounts frozen. And, obviously they and their families are not allowed to enter the United States. They have no due process. They have no way of facing their accusers, no nothing. And also Israelis who support them are subjected to the same sanctions so that they could see their bank accounts taken and stuff like that. So David Friedman, the former ambassador to Israel from the Trump administration, he wrote this tweet that I think characterizes the executive order very well. It says, by its terms, it could apply to any Israelis who oppose a two-state solution. Right now, that's more than 80% of the population. So anyone who the State Department feels is hostile to creating a Palestinian terrorist state could wake up one morning and find his funds frozen in his local bank. Not only is this an unlawful interference with another nation's internal politics and a key ally to boot, but it illegally punishes Israelis for exercising their free speech. So, that's what happened. And then Elchanan Groner from the Jewish Voice news agency that I've cited many times his work, he posted this tweet, which I'm just going to explain here. So it says, settler violence this morning, Sigal Shukrun and Adi Cohen from the far-left organization looking the occupation in the eye, came to the outskirts of Jericho, and they started harassing an a Jewish shepherd. The head of security in the community, he himself was located within the community town limits or whatever itself, he comes out and starts talking to them to try to find out what's going on. And they photographed, they documented a very calm discussion that he was having with them to try to figure out what was going on while they were harassing this shepherd. And their fellow anarchist, Guy Hirschfeld, had already posted the picture of the Israeli security guy trying to clarify what was happening on his Facebook page, and threatened that he was on the way to being sanctioned by the United States as well. And he had tipped the U.S. Embassy in Israel. So that this is how it works, and this is the assembly line, and this is what happens, and it's happened before and it's happening now. And if that were the only thing that they were doing to criminalize Israelis, that would be bad enough, because as Ambassador Friedman said, what they're basically saying is that anybody who opposes a two-state solution is a potential subject for U.S. financial sanctions. Anybody who opposes Hadi Almar's plan to build a Palestinian terrorist state in Israel's midst, because the Palestinians are just like Americans, could find himself or herself, like me, for instance, subjected to U.S. citizens, to U.S. sanctions. And that's not it. They also have a plan to reinstate the 1970s Hansel memo, which claimed that Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria are illegal. And if that happens, then again, you can see even more stepped up U.S. interference in Israeli military operations. And in fact, it's already gotten to unprecedented heights, because the State Department issued a letter to the IDF a couple of months ago that came out last week, that demanded explanations for a series of counterterror measures that have taken place in Judea and Samaria since October 7th. So, I've talked about this in the past, that motivation among the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria to carry out copycat attacks against Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria, and also in the Gilboa area, in the Sharon district. So on the eastern side of the 1949 armistice lines and the western side, so all Israelis, their motivation to carry out October 7th style attacks is sky high. And as a result, the IDF has carried out an unprecedented tempo of counterterrorist operations throughout Judea and Samaria, particularly in Samaria around Jenin and Nablus, but not only, and in Hebron in the south. And about 500 terrorists have been killed in those raids, and that's because there are so many of them. So the United States has sent Israel a list of fights, and after what they did with Shirin Abu Akleh's death while embedded with Islamic jihadists, we can only imagine what the nature of these inquiries are. And Israel only has another month, I think, to give them answers to their specific questions. And if Israel doesn't respond in a way that satisfies Hadi Amar, then Israel will be subjected to a weapons embargo to the specific units that were involved. So you're not going to be allowed to give weapons to units that the United States has decided to demonize because they're effective in counterterrorism measures against Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. And those Palestinians are just like Americans, and Israelis are just like Hamas, which doesn't represent anybody in the Palestinian society. Anyway, so that's that. And then this week, or last week while I was in D.C., Biden put out this memo, this national security memorandum, where he said that it was issued on February 8th, and that countries that receive U.S. military funding or military supply have to respond within 45 days, prove that they abide by international human rights standards that the U.S. military abides by. In other words, prove that you stop beating your wife, right? That's the gaslighting strategy that the United States uses against Israel to incriminate us, and that if they don't, that they will not receive any further weapons. And so there's, and if that were enough, it is. But on the basis of that, there's like this really interesting discourse being carried out, led by the United States and embraced by the Europeans and by the UN institutions, that are all rowing in the same direction. And that direction is to castigate Israel as Hamas, while, airbrushing every aspect of Palestinian society out of their description of Palestinian society in order to present them as innocents, as really, progressives, just like Americans, or at least just like the Democratic Party. So on this level, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell came out, I think, yesterday, and called for a weapons embargo against Israel. Just as the Biden administration is passing this these executive orders and issuing guidance from the National Security Council. The State Department is putting out these threats to Israeli forces operating in Judea and Samaria. So Joseph Borrell takes it a step further and says, hey, what we really need is for the United States to stop supplying Israel with weapons so that it can't continue to carry out these terrible war crimes. You have the International Criminal Court, their prosecutor, whose name, by the way, is just for knowing Kareem Khan, like, Genghis Khan. He came out on Monday threatening Israel with war crimes tribunals if we go into Rafah, because after the daring commando raid that on Sunday night, Monday morning, rescued the two hostages, Fernando Marmin and Louis Har, the Palestinians said, oh, it's a terrible massacre. Israel killed 100 people. By the way, everybody who was killed was part of the hostage keeping, taking, guarding, so that they're all terrorists, including the family that enslaved them and made them cook for them while they were starving them to death, and they came back to Israel with their body weight reduced by half. So the 100 maybe Palestinians, and who knows how many it really was, who were killed in Rafah, are being touted by the Palestinians as proof that Israel committed war crimes when it was ending the war crime of holding these two men hostage. And the funny thing, or the horrible thing, is that the U.S. media, the New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, and the White House all put out statements. Well, the media put out headlines that, like totally said that, it's really terrible. Israel killed all these poor Palestinians in Rafah during the hostage rescue operation. They played down the hostage rescue, and the headlines were about the terrorists that were killed, and they're all, of course, innocent civilians. So the Biden administration latched onto it and said, we're happy with the hostage rescue, but we're really upset by all the civilian casualties that were caused during the thing. And this is all just Hamas propaganda put out by the likes of reporters like Mohammed Washba from Al Jazeera, who is also a Hamas terror commander. And so the United States is relying on these reports by Hamas media, by Hamas humanitarian aid workers, from UNRWA, which is a terrorist organization, and they're all coming out because they're all Hamas. They're all saying that Israel is a war criminal. And rather than say this is absolute nonsense, the Americans, the Biden administration, are saying, yeah, this is terrible, terrible, terrible. And Israel, you have 45 days to prove you stopped beating your wife. And so then it comes to, of course, the war itself. So what was I saying? Kareem Khan said Monday he threatened Israel with harsher war crime scrutiny if it invades Rafah. He wrote on Twitter, I am deeply concerned by the reported bombardment and potential ground incursion by Israeli forces in Rafah. And then Biden himself, he talked with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the telephone on, I think, Monday night for 45 minutes. And he came off that, and 5 of his aides told the New York Times, I think it was, NBC News, that Bibi is an a-hole. Well, they use the whole word, whatever. And that he drives them crazy, and that he's the chief obstacle to a ceasefire because Bibi refuses. Bibi is making it impossible for Biden to convince Israel's generals to stand down. And that's terrible, and he can't stand him, and he's horrible. He sent 7 of his top aides to Detroit to campaign for him. Not sure, how that works in U.S. law, that you have White House officials and USAID administrators, Samantha Power, going down to Dearborn and Detroit to explain to the local Hamas supporters there that they're really on their side and not Israel's side. But that's how they've played it. John Feiner, as Deputy National Security Advisor, said he doesn't believe. He has no confidence in the Israeli government because, this is part of the Biden administration's plan also, which is to overthrow the Israeli government, right? Netanyahu has to go. We talked about this before. Andrea Mitchell wrote about it. She said it. They're looking for the day after Netanyahu. Of course, all of these statements and all of these threats against Israel just ensure that Netanyahu will get another 5 terms in office. But be that as it may, that's what they're all about, is getting after Netanyahu. So They want to overthrow the government. They support Hamas instead of Israel. They're demonizing Israel in order to make their case for Hamas, and they're whitewashing, airbrushing out everything about the Palestinians so that you won't realize that the Palestinians are Hamas. They all support Hamas, and there is no option other than Hamas. Then we have a West Point a West Point professor named John Spencer. He's the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute, MWI, at West Point. He's the co-director of the Modern War Institute's Urban Warfare Project and the host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. So he's become a bit of a celebrity in Israel because he's been coming up with these assessments, these analyses of Israel's war effort in Gaza that paint a totally different picture. And basically he says, in so many words, that there's no comparison in the history of warfare to the war that Israel is fighting now in Gaza, that, that Israel is fighting in densely populated population centers, not only above ground, but throughout 400 miles of the underground tunnels, something that the United States never faced. The closest is in the Battle of Manila in 1945, not in Mosul, not in Fallujah, not the Syrian civil war, not the Russian war in Ukraine, nothing. It's like the combat operation that Israel faces in Gaza. Israel, he said in a Newsweek article that he published this past week, claims that it's killed 10,000 terrorists. Hamas says 24,000 in total. So that ratio is actually the lowest civilian to terrorist or militant or soldier, whatever you want to call them, in any battle, ever. And so here's the United States accusing Israel of killing thousands of Palestinian children. That's what President Biden said on Monday. And here you have this West Point professor saying, no, this is the most amazing thing. It puts us to shame. It puts our battles in Iraq to shame. It's got no parallel anywhere. And that's the truth. That's the truth. And so the United States doesn't want Israel to fight in Rafah. They say that there are 1.4 million refugees in Rafah, and nobody questions that data. Nobody questions Hamas's casualty data. Nobody questions Hamas's reporters' data and reports on what's going on the ground. Nothing. 3 months after the IDF took out the Hamas control center in Shifa Hospital in northern Gaza, suddenly the New York Times wrote a report indicating that Israel was right, that it was an operational hub. That's where the hostages were being held in northern Gaza, and the Biden administration was threatening Israel with war crimes investigations if it went through with the operation. But there it was. Israel was totally right. It takes 3 months, but the New York Times might eventually publish an article attesting to that. In the meantime, Israel is on trial at the International Court of Justice for genocide, and the Biden administration is accusing us of war crimes in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza, and seeking proof that we're not. So I think here, we get to the end of this long news summary. I guess I just had a lot to talk about because I've been away for so long. But what we see here is that the whole concept of a Palestinian state means that you are opposed to the Jewish state, because this is a zero-sum game. This is a zero-sum game because the Palestinians as a society are organized around the goal of annihilating the Jews. And their supporters are in America too, and in Europe, which is why you're seeing this violent expression of anti-Semitism in a Nazi-like level in New York, in Chicago, in LA, all over in Washington, all over the United States, in London, in Leeds, in Paris, and all of these cities around the Western world, because when they feel emboldened in this area, the Palestinians here, 94% of them have never felt prouder. They're emboldened as well in the West, which funds and supports them. So you're getting this kind of spasm. And, you can't have campuses that claim that Israel is a settler colonialist state and also be a place where Jews can feel comfortable, because you can't, because this is a zero-sum game. It's either us or them. It's not going to be both. You can't have a two-state solution. A two-state solution is a euphemism for the annihilation of Israel. And that's clear. The Palestinians have had a state in Gaza since Israel pulled out in 2005, and they turned it into, as John Spencer says, the most complex, dangerous arena of warfare anybody's ever faced. And this is what would happen everywhere, and this is why Israel cannot have a Palestinian state, because it's an existential threat, probably more profound than Iran's nuclear weapons. And and that's just a fact. And so when I was in Washington last week, I was talking, I had the pleasure of talking to many lawmakers, and think the highlights of that were people like Senator Cruz and Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Haggerty from Tennessee as well, and some great members of Congress like Bob Good and Michael Waltz and Chip Roy and others. And, they very much support Israel. I understand it's a very difficult political environment. Their elections have consequences. Joe Biden, the president's in charge of foreign policy. The Senate passed an aid bill over the weekend that provides $94 billion, something like that, in aid to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. I don't know how it'll get through with Ukraine in it in the House. I don't know what's going to happen. But I think the most important thing, it's very important to pass the military assistance. Obviously, we need 2 years essentially to be independent of American weapons supplies here in Israel, and we're at war, and we need help. But more to the point, I think that it's important to point out that Biden's plan for unilateral recognition of Palestinian statehood is the most anti-Israel position ever adopted by an American president. All of his policies, a panoply of his policies that he's adopting regarding Hamas and regarding Israel, are unbelievably hostile, unprecedentedly hostile to Israel, and they have to be opposed. We have great friends in Washington. I know the United States is a pro-Israel country. Americans support Israel. And Philly, I went to Washington last week to raise awareness of just how bad the situation is, because when you get your news from places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, it's hard to know. And I came back discouraged because of the incredible hostility of the Biden administration and their amen choruses, to paraphrase the anti-Semite Pat Buchanan in the Congress, people like Senator Chris Von Hollen, who accuses Israel of war crimes on the Senate floor. So that's very discouraging. There is really common ground there. But we also we're blessed with incredible friends. And I came away pretty confident, very confident that, that they understand what's at risk and what it would mean for the United States for Israel to lose this war, God forbid. And so it's a mixed bag, but, God bless America. And it's great to be home back in Israel. And we're going to win this. And I think I feel much more secure that we're not alone in this fight, even if the Biden administration's on our side. So those are my thoughts for now, and I'll talk to you again soon. Glad to be back. Take care.